Hi, I'm Lance Cottrell, Chief Scientist at Ntrepid. In the last episode, we looked at threat modeling a simple OSINT operation. In this episode, we're going to examine threat modeling a more complex investigation of an online criminal marketplace. Threat modeling is the key to discovering and mitigating vulnerabilities in managed attribution solutions. In this case, we'll be looking at threat modeling a scenario where the operator is trying to engage with an online illegal marketplace where their target is operating the website. I want to point out this scenario is completely fictitious. All of the locations and specific countries were made up just to demonstrate how threat modeling can be changed when we're looking at an international situation where the data flows are crossing international borders. Let's start off with a really quick recap of the managed attribution specific threat models. The first is the threats we're looking at, which we call CAKED. And CAKED stands for correlation of entities, attribution of actors, knowledge of operations, exposure of aliases, and discovery of resources. Those are the things that can lead to the downfall of a misattributed operation. Any of those threats could be realized through the actions of one of four different kinds of threat actors. The first is the unprivileged observer. This is really literally anyone on the internet. The next is someone on the wire, someone who can intercept your communications in flight between 2 points in the solutions network. Next is the person who's on the device, either on one of your servers or on the target server, or in fact the target's end PC. And finally, we have in the conversation. This is someone who is directly engaged between the operator and can see all of the messages, any metadata, even if it's end-to-end encrypted communications, they're in the conversation. They can see all of that directly. All of these threats and threat actors need to be considered from the perspective of different domains, right? In addition to the cyber domain, where we're looking at the internet communications, we need to be thinking about phone communications and SMS messages. We need to be thinking about financial transactions and all the different forms they might be taking. We need to consider all of those threats in the context of physical infrastructure, if there's servers or buildings or offices, apartments, and in the context of virtual infrastructure, if we're getting domain names or certificates or cloud services. And they're tightly interwoven. So in many cases, a single transaction, a single entity, a single situation will actually involve multiple domains at once. In this scenario, we're looking at an operator who wants to engage on this criminal marketplace. They need to be able to engage in transactions, buying and selling goods or information on that site. And for the purposes of this model, we're going to assume that's taking place with conventional finances, ordinary banking, as opposed to Bitcoin or suitcases of money or something else, each of which would have their own strengths and weaknesses and require different kinds of threat modeling, but the same process would be used. This scenario also helps to elucidate the international complexities, where the operator is working inside the United States, but the target web server that he's accessing is located, in this example, in Mexico. And so we're going to have cross-border flows of all of the different data and finances that are going on. Right off the bat, this is a much more delicate and vulnerable operation than the OSINT example, because our target is actually operating the web server. So they have access to a whole lot more data and metadata about the transactions. They can see a lot of details about the operator's computer and about the network connection that's coming in. And by operating the website, they can even run tests and probes back against the operator. So there's a lot more care that needs to be taken here in the technical side of the tradecraft to ensure that the alias or the attribution aren't exposed. So here's a possible misattribution solution that we might apply to this use case. We've put in extra layers of misdirection because now when we're working in foreign countries, we may be less trusting of the local ISPs or governments and their ability to monitor the traffic. So rather than connecting from the operator to the misattribution server to a relay to the target, we've now added an additional relay to give extra standoff so that someone who's able to see one or more points in that outside the US still is not going to be able to track it all the way back. And we've intentionally put at least one of these relays in a European country, which we're going to assume is more trusted than the South American or Mexican points of presence, which for the purposes of this model, we're going to assume are less trusted by our operator. Again, all of these locations are entirely just made up for the purposes of this scenario. However, as you can see in this model, there are direct connections still from the operator to the website. The financial transactions are exposed. So we're going to need to increase the complexity of our solution and add in intermediaries for the financial path as well, so that no single point of observation can see that entire path and can expose us to the caked threats. So in this case, we have an American bank, a Swiss bank, and an Argentinian bank, and the money's flowing from one to the next. And as you can see in this scenario, we're also carefully using the appropriate bank to pay for the next node in the chain. So when we need to acquire a node, we're paying for it with a bank associated with the previous node, and we're doing so online from that previous node. So each node is doing all of the transactions, financial and communication, to get to the next node. And for simplicity, I've left out here things like phone communications and SMS, which probably are also taking place and would likewise need to be interspersed appropriately to make sure that no one point of visibility within this network, no one threat actor would be able to see farther back because they're looking at phone transactions, for example, rather than internet transactions. We want to make sure that all of these different domains are providing the same level of cover and working in lockstep. So now let's start to threat model this scenario. So to keep this cast somewhat under control in length, we're going to look at just 4 different threat actors. We're going to look at someone who has access to the American banking institution. We're going to look at someone at the Argentinian bank, at the Brazilian exit point, and, of course, our target operating the web server in Mexico. First, let's look at the website. This is the target's website, so they have control of that. They're able to look at all of those technical indicators. They can see IP addresses, they can see metadata, they can see all the HTTP headers, they can launch attacks back against the investigator. They are in a really good position to try to detect the operation, right? They want knowledge of the operation. They want to expose aliases. They would love to attribute the original operator, and they've got a lot of the tools to do that, and the motivation, the paranoia, and since they're operating the website, they may well have the technical skills. So this is going to be one of the biggest threats. So in this case, the mitigations are going to be largely on the managed attribution provider. That needs to be ensuring that all of the visible information that the website can see is consistent with being a normal user. It can't allow them to notice that you're using some sort of unusual tool set. In fact, you may need to make sure that you're blending in with other people using off-the-shelf tools. If everyone else visiting this website is using Tor, in fact, you may need to leave that exit site and then go through Tor before you access the server. Whatever the typical users are doing, it's important that we be replicating that in this solution. I'm not going to dig too deeply into those technical aspects because I did an entire cast earlier focusing just on the technical aspects of misattribution. And that'll give you a really good idea of the kind of mitigations you'd want to put in place to ensure that the target and its website is not able to expose you and act on any of those threats. In this particular design, the target can see that we're coming out of a Brazilian exit point. And so they can then scan that. We need to make sure that the fingerprint of that device, any server configurations there, aren't going to expose other infrastructure that we're using, particularly other infrastructure that we're using in the operation against this same target, because they may well then go scan the internet to look, are there other servers that look like this, that are running the same versions of software that match this pattern? And so we want to make sure that that's not something that's going on. That's an obvious mitigation that we'd want to put in place to protect ourselves. They're also going to be able to see that we're paying for the services and the information and whatever we're transacting on this website from an Argentine bank. And we're going to assume that that is an ordinary behavior and not something that's going to attract any particular attention from the website. If it would, Obviously, we'd want to pick a different location. We're always going to look at what's going to look normal to them. We know that the target can see that bank, and that needs to be consistent with where the traffic's coming from and the kind of behavior they see from other users. Now, if there's a threat actor sitting at the Argentinian bank, they can see that there are transactions taking place with the criminal website, and so they know that there's probably criminal activity going on. They can see that the money's coming in from a Swiss bank account, which again probably indicates there's something a little bit hinky going on, but that's probably also true of many of the other users of this criminal marketplace. So while that may look criminal, it in no way suggests that it is an information operation, that these are an operator going out and doing some kind of undercover activity. I think will look fairly normal to the website. And again, if it doesn't, that's something we want to mitigate and make some other choices. The bank can also see that the transactions are being initiated, the transactions to the criminal website, from that Brazilian exit point. So the same IP address that the target website sees placing orders is the IP address that the bank sees authorizing the financial transactions. So that's all nicely consistent. Now, if there's a threat actor on the Brazilian exit point, let's say a hacker that's managed to root that server, then they may be able to see some interesting things. They can see the transactions with the Argentinian bank. They can see that the server possibly was paid for from the Swiss bank. They can see incoming data from the Paris relay. They can see emails coming into that ISP from an email service, and there's another email service that is outgoing, going out to the target website. So they can see that there's a lot of infrastructure going on here, and that might suggest that there's an operation taking place. So that hacker might be able to get knowledge of the operation, that there is clearly someone doing something pretty sophisticated. But fortunately, they don't really get any information about who is doing the operation. They have no ability to attribute it back to the managed attribution provider or to the end operator. And if all the transactions are end-to-end encrypted, they may have no idea what kind of operation it is, what sort of transactions we're doing on that website. If it's a marketplace with all kinds of different activities taking place on it, they just know that there are connections and orders for money, but not at all what kind of actual things are being purchased, or whether we're a buyer or a seller, or what our relationship is within that space. But probably we want to make sure that we've got really good monitoring on that. So an obvious mitigation against this would be to ensure that if there's a threat actor that gets access to that node, there's some way to find out about it and then take that offline and potentially go to a backup set of infrastructure. Now, if it's a hacker, or indeed just an untrustworthy ISP that's looking closely at this exit node, they're also potentially going to get a lot of information about the detailed architecture of that node. And that could provide an ability to detect other infrastructure that we've deployed. If we're using the same model, again, the same software, especially the ISP, if we're doing it across multiple locations that that ISP operates, they may be able to very quickly recognize all of the other nodes we may have deployed. So to mitigate that, we want to make sure that either we're using very common configurations, or we're not using the same ISP for multiple operations in the same area or against the same target, or better yet, we're not using the same ISP at all. We're really spreading out our activities across many different ISPs to prevent that correlation. Or again, we could make sure that they all have different fingerprints, that we intentionally use different versions of the operating system, different flavors of proxy or what have you, to blur that fingerprint, blur that signature, so that it's not as easy to recognize the infrastructure. And if the ISP is looking, they might either not recognize our other servers or have many false positives, thinking many other people's infrastructure is actually part of our network, either of which makes it much more difficult for them to successfully try to identify what the operator's up to or unravel any kind of operations. Finally, let's look at a threat actor inside the American bank. And this is a presumably trusted bank, but there are, of course, foreigners working at almost every bank in the world. There will be people who may have infiltrated them, or perhaps the bank's been hacked. These are all possibilities and certainly things that have been known to happen. So let's look at what they can see. Well, they certainly know that an operation is taking place. They know that the operator's organization is sending out money. That money is being then moved on to a Swiss bank. It's being used to pay for the Paris relay. There are communications coming directly from the managed attribution service provider to make those distributions. So the person sitting in the bank watching all of these data flows and money flows is going to have a pretty clear idea that there's some kind of managed attribution operation taking place. However, they have no idea what kind of an operation that is. They don't know where in the world it is. They don't know what kind of target it might be going after. They don't know if it's OSINT or criminal investigations or infiltration or trying to disrupt some sort of radicalization network. They know that some sort of operation is taking place, but they can't attribute the operator to a particular operation out in the world. They don't have any visibility of the infrastructure. So this may well be a threat that the operator's organization chooses to accept. That yes, a bad actor there, as unlikely as they may be, still doesn't see anything that significantly compromises the operation. However, if it's important to avoid that connection so that the bank has no way of seeing the relationship, say, even between the operator's organization and the managed attribution service provider, we're going to need to put in another layer. Maybe there needs to be some other way of transporting the money. We move to some other mechanism at that point, or use additional levels of obfuscation to hide that connection. Again, look at who is it, what can they see, is that a threat, and is it worth the extra effort, money, time, and resources to mitigate against that? But even if you choose not to mitigate it, it is one of those things we want to capture so that we have a clear record that yes, we understand that's a threat, and we've chosen to accept it. This often becomes very important later when someone in a meeting pops up with this as a question, goes, hey, wait a minute, couldn't this happen? And if you have this analysis in place, you can go, of course it could happen, we've thought about that, here's the analysis we did, and here's why we have chosen to take the steps we did, either some partway mitigation or just accepting that as a reasonable risk and moving on, because obviously budgets and time aren't infinite. And again, the procedure is always the same. You're going to look at your diagram, look at all of the links, all of the objects, all the different kinds of threat actors against each one of the domains, work out, is it being mitigated? Do we need to mitigate it? Is this a risk that's unacceptable? If it is, then you need to update the diagram with that mitigation in place and then repeat the analysis on everything that's been affected until you reach a state that you're comfortable with it. This is a solution that meets our requirements, meets our needs, and we're comfortable to deploy. And remember, this is really just a toy model and a toy threat modeling. I'm ignoring many different actors. We've only looked at a couple of kinds of threat actors within this model. And we're ignoring things like many of these transactions might have taken setting up front companies. There might be organizations we needed to create, or new domain names or certificates or other things that would be involved in this. I don't have any phone call tracks within this model. Again, just to keep the complexity under control. But when you're threat modeling your solution, you'll want to make sure that you do include every single one of those domains inside your diagram so you can individually consider them and do a full threat modeling to ensure that you've captured all of the threats and understand exactly what your risk posture is. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this episode enjoyable and interesting, and if so, please like and subscribe, and then click the red bell icon to be informed every time new episodes are uploaded. We release new content every other week, and we'd love to hear from you what other topics you'd like to see covered. Please let us know down in the comments. Till next time, ciao!